Welcome to another episode of Chak's Chat. Join Chad Chelius and me, Dax Castro, where each week we wax poetic about document accessibility topics, tips, and the struggle of remediation and compliance. So sit back, grab your favorite mug of whatever, and let's get started.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Chak's Chat podcast. My name is Chad Chelius. I'm an Adobe certified instructor, as well as Director of Training Solutions and Principal at Chak's Training and Consulting.
And my name is Dax Castro. I am an Adobe certified PDF accessibility trainer, and Chad and I are also certified as accessible document specialists by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. And if you'd like your certification for the ADS or the web accessibility specialist, you can head on over to accessibilityassociation.org/certifications. And you can check out Chad coming up here shortly at Enabling, which is at an IAAP sponsored event, right, Chad?
Yep. Yeah. I'm going to be doing a document accessibility session for the IAAP. It's going to be a full day event down at Enabling, and I'm really excited about it because Enabling is typically primarily like a panel-based conference. You know what I mean? They have a lot of panel discussions and stuff. And so the fact that they're having like kind of a hands-on, kind of a real world session, I think is really exciting. So hopefully people enjoy that.
Yeah. And actually that week's a busy week for you because you'll be at Adobe Max for a total of 1 day and then flying back home to go rush to do that other one. You are a busy bee, sir. Busy bee.
I think it's technically 2 days. I'll be at Max for 2 days. Yeah. And then,
awesome.
And then I turn around and so, yeah, West Coast, East Coast, bouncing back and forth. But I'm looking forward to it because you're presenting at Adobe Max this year.
Yeah, I'm doing a lab this year, which is great.
Yeah.
It's going to be my first lab at Adobe Max. Most of the other things have been sessions, and it's on InDesign for accessibility. So we're going to have, I think it's running 3 different times or 2 different times. So I think we get how many are in a lab, Chad? About 100?
Usually about 100. Yeah. I mean, I think I've done 5 labs at Adobe Max in years past, and typically it's around 100 people. But then also this year I'm doing a virtual session at Adobe Max. So,
yes, you are. Yeah.
So we're actually both presenting this year. My session is more of a high level document accessibility session. They were trying to reach like a broader audience, and so it's not going to be as intense, but I think it's going to be some really good information, especially if you're just getting started with accessibility or you just want to know some fundamentals, between Dax's lab and my session, some good stuff for accessibility.
Absolutely. Well, we have waxed poetic enough. Let us dive into today's topic, which is things to consider when developing complex infographics. So you and I were talking earlier this week, and it's kind of spurred some conversation based off of our Facebook group. And for those who don't know, PDF accessibility, just go search that on Facebook. Our group is over 3,700 now, Chad. We are well past 3,700. And we are 30,000 downloads, more than 30,000 downloads, approaching 31,000 for the podcast.
Yeah.
So I'm super
really
excited.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome.
So someone had posted a very complex table with some mathematics. It's kind of was a visual aid to be able to figure out what an addition problem is. How many ways can you add a number X with a number Y to equal 64? And the question was, how do I make this accessible? What's the user experience? And you and I started talking about all the different ways that we could probably approach it. But it really brought on the idea of what are the questions that you need to ask when you start approaching a project like this. And I think our listeners, hopefully all of you are, for those of you that tell me, I get these emails all the time where they say, I feel like you're my best friend. I'm listening to you in the car. I want to shout out to all of you and say, I'm right here with you. Good morning. And thank you so much for being a part of the show.
And this discussion is why we have, you and I do a webinar called, writing effective alternate text, right? We
Well,
we
and
have
we
that
also
one,
have another,
and then we have
yeah,
one on complex infographics, right?
right.
And there's
Designing with
a
accessibility in mind. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So technically three
Yeah.
sessions, right? So, and there's a reason for that. And it's because of what we're talking about here, right? Because
Yes.
there's never people come to us and want a black and white answer.
Yeah. They want a single approach.
Yeah. They're like, how do I do this? And very rarely do we say, oh, you just do this,
Yeah.
because there's so many variables that come into answering that question, or directing you into the right approach, right? And
Well,
so there's some
uh-huh.
questions that need to be answered, right? And that's really what we're talking about today.
Right. And so for those of you listening, get out your notepads. There are 7 questions that we are going to give you that you should ask yourself when you're designing or considering designing a complex infographic. And that could be a complex bar chart or line graph. It could be a flow chart. It could be an org chart. It could be a table. Anything that is complex that needs to be thought out to understand which is our very first question, is what do I want the user experience to be? And if you've taken any of our classes, we say this over and over and over again. You have to ask yourself walking into it, what do I want the user experience to be? If I could wave a magic wand and just come up with the ideal scenario for a person using this element, what would that look like?
Yeah.
Because without that, you can't move forward, right? You can't start to develop a solution for a problem you haven't yet defined.
And part of it also comes down to thinking about the problem differently,
Yep.
and it's a hard thing to do. I mean, you and I were talking about this before we started recording today, right? And what I always tell people that we have a tendency to forget is the fact that, as a sighted user, we benefit from the helicopter view.
Yes.
Like, we benefit from being able to look at things from a high level view, and we can process a lot of information very quickly, right? So
Yep.
the figure you were talking about, it was like a table of a bunch of squares.
Mm-hmm.
And as a sighted user, I could kind of look at that, and very quickly I could process that. But when people are using assistive technology, you got to remember they've got to dive into the object and read the components of that object. And that's why it's important to ask the question that you brought up, Dax, which is, what do I want the user experience to be? If I'm using assistive technology, how am I going to understand this? How am I going to be able to process this information?
Well, there's a good friend of mine, Doug Sheppers, wrote a paper, and I've actually seen him present a couple of different times. And he talks about uh, um, cognitive load, and that when you process an infographic, there are so many things that require very little cognitive load. Color contrast, where it is spatially on the page, the size relative to one another. Those things take a super small amount of cognitive load to understand. The difference between one symbol and another, the actual difference between one color and another, the way things are associated in other ways requires more cognitive load. So when you talk about that helicopter view, you are literally unknowingly talking about those things that require very little cognitive load, right? And
Yeah.
so we think we understand. Usually what happens is, when you walk into a problem, you think one thing. By the time you've talked through all of the questions, you kind of think another way, and
Yeah.
because you start evaluating those things. But I think the one of the things that you and I benefit from most is already understanding the screen reader user's
Mm-hmm.
experience. And
Yep.
I think that's a hard thing for a lot of other people, right?
I agree with you. I totally agree with you. I mean, I would say it's an acquired skill. You know what I mean?
Agreed.
I think because you and I are so deep into what we do, that and we've said many, many times before how I always focus on the user experience.
Right.
And to be able to do that, I need to understand that experience. I need to
100%.
understand how people with assistive technology consume content. And that could be a low vision user using a magnifier.
Yep.
It could also be a non-sighted user using JAWS or NVDA. So those are the things that are always in the back of my head when I'm making documents compliant or trying to figure out how to make them compliant is, as we just said, what do I want that user experience to be? And
Right.
it's just such an important question to be able to ask. And again, you don't have to be an expert, guys, but I would say like it's a great skill to develop. Just always understanding what that user experience is going to be is so beneficial to being able to, when you and I answer questions, it's not that we always know the answer immediately.
We can work through the problem. We are good problem
Yeah.
solvers and troubleshooters. And it's actually I think I might have mentioned this before, but maybe not. Um, as a parent, my goal is to teach my children how to independently problem solve.
Hmm.
I want to give them the skills to look at a problem, evaluate it, and come up with a solution. I don't need them to know math. I don't care if they know history. I do need them to know math. That's actually a core thing. But I need them to just be able to apply what they've learned systematically to a problem and go, okay, I need to do this, or I'm going shopping to buy, and my budget is $25. How can I make my money go the farthest and be able to process that, right? And
Yeah.
and if I could teach my kids to be independent problem solvers, the world is theirs. They
Yeah.
can go anywhere and do anything. I don't need them to be good at a certain skill. I just need them to be able to apply a process to be able to come up with a solution. Um, Chad, we just had our class document testing with NVDA just this last week.
Yeah.
And it was a great class. And a lot of people were like, well, I open NVDA and I get scared. It's got so many things going on. Just take our class, guys. I
Yeah.
promise you, it will help you tremendously. I just learned a new shortcut key.
Yeah.
Insert M silences the mouse. So when you
Yeah.
mouse over things, you hear NVDA trying to speak everything you're touching, but insert M turns off that voice. And I've been using Screen Reader for 3 years now, avidly, almost every single day. And we're always learning. So number one is, what do we want the user experience to be? Number two, Chad?
What is the most important information? Okay. So, when you're looking at your infographic, y- you know, Dax, you and I are graphic designers, right?
Right.
And we always talk about the call to attention, right?
Yeah.
When you're doing a graphic design, there's always a call to attention. What is the most important element on the page?
Yes.
And so, same thing with an infographic. What is the most important information about that infographic? What is
Right.
the key thing that you want the user to know? And that's really important question to answer because it's going to help you to convey that information to the end user in a more appropriate way.
And it's not just, how do I order my tags so
No.
that presents first. Now, we talked about that kind of in a podcast before last about covers, right? Doing accessible magazine covers. So if you haven't listened to that podcast, go back and listen to it. It was the one not last week, but the week before, about accessible covers. But so you want to decide from a visual standpoint, what's the biggest thing on the page? It is how our brain processes the information, but also what has the most color contrast on the page. So from a low vision user standpoint, my brain is going to automatically gravitate to the thing I can read the clearest.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have good color contrast with your large text, magazine cover title, that's going to really help someone identify. I've seen some of these magazines, several of them have big, giant white text that's Arial, block font, super prominent. GQ magazines, when I was coming to mind, right? Super large letters. But then I see others and it's like this scripty font you can hardly see at the top. And I'm just like, who designed that magazine?
It drives me crazy, Dax. When I'm driving, at least here in Pennsylvania, we have a lot of billboards, right? And when I look at some of these billboards, the font that they choose,
Yeah.
I can't even read it driving in my car, and so it's a very similar it's a very similar thing that we're talking about, because on a billboard, you only have 5 seconds
Even
to
less sometimes. Yeah.
right to convey your point. And if all the text is small, or it's using a font that I can't read, you've failed. You've completely failed in your job to make this billboard stand out, you know?
Well, I used to do lawyer billboards, right? That's was a job of
Oh
mine.
yeah.
Actually, I even did voiceovers. If you or someone you love has been hurt in an accident, call the law offices of Johnson and Johnson. I used to do that stuff. And so one of the things that always got me is the lawyers want their pictures to be the most giant thing on the board, and then
Yeah.
their name, and then the phone number is this small little thing. And I'm
And you're
going,
like, nobody cares.
no one
Nobody cares
cares.
what you looks like.
They want to know your phone number. How do I
Yeah.
contact you? Right.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of conversations on that end. So what's the most important
Yeah.
thing that I want to relate? Because the most important thing is going to be, number one, first in the tags tree order, right? In the case of the cover, the very top thing was some link to an article on page 3, and then the magazine title. But in the tags tree, the title was the very first thing, right? The next thing is you want it to be the thing that has the most color contrast, that is the largest, or that is it's maybe on a solid field where everything else might be a little bit more busy. So what's that most important thing? But there's a second thing we need to think about when we're talking about infographics, as far as what is the most important information, and that comes to alt text, right? Because
Mhm.
oftentimes our infographics are a series of images paneled together, or a single image, and we're trying to write information. And the one thing I think of automatically, Chad, is parking maps. We get these parking maps all the
Oh
time for,
yeah.
hospitals, or, business parks or whatever. And at some point, there's information about lot A is patient parking and lot B is, visitor parking. And then at the bottom of that long list is the rate information for, what the daily rate or hourly rate is, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And you and I were talking, like, if it cost me $50 a day to park in that lot, I'm moving on. I don't want
Right,
to have to read through this whole thing to find out that it's $50 a day. You know what I mean? So
right.
that's important information, right? I mean, maybe not the most important, but after, you know, parking map for this facility, I want that rate to be very, very close behind, very
Well,
soon afterwards.
and typically you would tell someone lot B is the closest to emergency parking, or lot A is the closest to the main entrance. And then you would
Right.
say rates are, because in alt text, if I have to list 10 different lots, you can bet that the person using assistive technology is not going to listen to all 10
Yeah.
lot
Yeah.
numbers, because you can skip alt text. You can start to hear it and go, oh yeah, I don't want to listen to all that, and then
Yep.
move on. And if you get to, well, lot 3 is the lot I want to go to, and you just move on to the next element, you've missed the rate information. So present the most important information first in your alt text, when you go that route, right?
Yeah. And I mean, along that lines, if possible, weight the tag heavier, right? Meaning, like, make it an H1 or an H2 if possible, right?
Right.
You
Well,
can't
and that's
always
if you
do
have
that.
text on, right.
Right. You can't
If
always
it's
do that. But if you can, I will often take the extra time to tag an element of that infographic if it's possible, right? It's not always
right.
possible, but sometimes if I can, I'll do it just to put more weight on that information.
Well, for those of you listening, what Chad's talking about is that oftentimes a map is not a JPEG or a PNG embedded in a document. It was created in Illustrator or some other design program. Hopefully, I'm begging you, do not create these in InDesign. I have seen some people who use InDesign like Illustrator because they're just familiar with it. Please use Illustrator for this type of stuff. But they'll drop an Illustrator map into their document, and when we get it as remediators, that text is still live. Even though it's all kind of wrapped in a figure, it's still live text. And we can go in and selectively select that text and break it out of the graphic and then tag it with a heading, or other tag
Yeah.
that helps further identify stuff. So definitely approach. And if you want to learn more about those approaches, our Designing with Accessibility in Mind class is definitely one you should take a look at. I think that's going to be happening later in September, or might be the end of August. I'll have to go look on the schedule.
Yeah.
So the next one is, does content order matter? Right? So our first question was, what do we want the user experience to be? Our second question is, what's the most important information? Our third question is, does the content order matter? Because, you and I teach in our Designing with Accessibility in Mind class that we have a couple examples, one of which is a life cycle chart of, well, I have one that's for a frog, but I also have one that's the air. It's water. It's the life cycle of water. And it talks about percolation and evaporation and rain and snow and all of that. There is an order to it, but there's about 3 different paths within this infographic that a user could take. So as the designer, I have to figure out which order makes the most sense and group them into kind of, okay, this is order 1, and then this is order 2, and this is order 3. But sometimes it doesn't matter. It's just a series of thought bubbles that have a bunch of factoids over the top of something else. And the goal here, guys, is think about, does content matter? And then adjust your tags tree into that same order so that the end user can walk through it in the same way you expect.
Yeah. Yeah. When you're talking about that, I mean, it's really important, because I remember that infographic you're referring to, and it's really like one big image.
Yep.
And if you want to learn something really cool, come to that session. Which one is that? Designing with Accessibility in Mind?
Yeah. And if I'm presenting at any conference that has advanced infographics, it is definitely part of those sessions.
And it's just such a cool example, because you take this single big figure and break it up into chunks.
Yep.
So that you can explain the different portions of that life cycle coherently and in the appropriate order. Right.
Well, and it limits the alt text, because now you have 12 images with a single sentence or two that describes snow can fall in, or water can fall in the form of snow, rain, or sleet,
And to prepare the user, we will often put a sentence, sometimes hidden, but we'll put a sentence that says, the following 7 figures describe the life cycle of, I forget what that was, but
water life cycle.
Yeah, the water life cycle, so that you're kind of preparing the user. Okay, this is what I'm about to hear.
Right.
Don't skip the next 6 figures or 7 figures, because it's kind of important. You know what I mean?
And preparing the user.
Yeah, you're preparing the user, for what's coming up.
Well, and it's kind of like why we use a list tag. I had a conversation, this is a little bit of a sidebar from our discussion here, but I had a conversation with someone about why use a list tag when the bullet is there. They hear bullet, John Smith, bullet, Mary Jones, bullet, whatever. And I said, well, how many bullets are there? And they looked at the paper and they said, well, there's just 6. And I said, how do you know that? He goes, well, it's right there. And I said, but the screen reader user doesn't know that. Imagine there's 100. The idea of a list, having the list tag, voices to the user that it's going to say list 100 items, right? And and that gives the user power. The power of, do I want to listen to all 100? We don't get that when you have, infographic 7 figures, right? It doesn't do that. So we have to give them a little bit of help.
Hopefully you don't encounter a list with 100 items, because
you do.
But I know you
did. You did with that document with the graduates.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
And also, like I've gotten documents where the last page of the document is a list of all the zip codes that they service.
Right.
And it's like 150 zip codes.
Well, but see, at that point, the end user is probably going to hear zip codes, list, 150 items. And then they're going to probably go, I wonder if mine's in here. They would probably just hit Control F to do a find and then search for their zip code rather than cycling through them all. Right?
Well, and that's a really good point, Dax, because in the file, the zip codes were all P tags.
Right. That's
And in hindsight, what I could have done is selected all of them, changed them to list items,
right.
and moved them into a list tag.
Yeah.
And that way, when they read that section, it would say zip codes and then
Yep.
list with 150 items. And then they'd give like, okay, I'm not going to read this, but thank you for letting me know.
Yeah.
And to your point, they could have done a find and said, is 19607 in this list? And,
Right.
and if the answer is no, then bummer, or what,
Yeah.
what, I don't
Right.
know.
Well, the other thing to think about here is the difference between a barrier and a failure. Now, you and I
Yeah.
know the rules, and info in relationships is a very common basic rule, and
important.
something and important. If something's an item, if something's a heading or a list, it should be tagged as a heading or a list. But you have to think about barrier versus, I guess, compliance, right? Barrier versus bad user experience.
Yeah.
Right. Can you get to the information? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a barrier? Not really. Right. So in this case, if I had 100 pages and there were 50 different lists and each of them had, I don't know, 25 to 50 items in each one, and I'm deciding whether or not I need to spend 4 hours remediating this document or just having it, because they're all tagged as paragraphs. My answer to you is depends on what your goal is. If you're trying to be technically compliant, absolutely go through and tag it all the way you're supposed to. But if you're trying to release a document and you've got 30 minutes to get it out or an hour to get it out, and you're going, I don't know, should I get this out or should I not? The answer is some accessibility is better than no accessibility. And in this case, paragraph tags, while not ideal, are
it's
not a barrier.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's where user experience comes into the equation, right? Because if I could have told them there was a list of 150 items, that would have been very helpful to them.
Yep.
Right. If it said zip codes, list with 150 items, they could have been like, okay, pump the brakes, right?
Yep.
You know what I mean? I don't want to listen to all 150 items. And then they could have proceeded, they could have skipped over the list. They could have proceeded, and taken a different approach. So it's all about just making it a comfortable experience for the user, right?
Right. Well, we get caught up in compliance and I'm just, I tell people all the time, I don't care about the rules. They help me get there. They give me structure so that we're all trying to follow the same thing. But my end result is I can make a document accessible using understanding zero principles of accessibility, but using a screen reader and testing the document to ensure that there's a good user experience, right? I mean, that's the whole point.
Yeah. But I think I just thought of something, Dax. I think we as people get into this trap where we only see things with bullets or numbers as lists.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like when you're, when you're making a document compliant or whatever, you're like, oh, here's a list. Here's a list,
right,
because they've got a bullet or a number in front of them.
Right.
But when you see a page full of zip codes, there's no bullet or number there.
Okay,
so
gotcha.
You've got to think deeper than what's on the surface, right? You got to think deeper of what's on paper and be like, okay, listen, these don't have a bullet or a number, but fundamentally it's a list. And in this case, it's a list of zip codes.
Well, and the opposite is true. We see documents all the time where there's the number 1 and then there's a title. And then there's 5 paragraphs, a bulleted list, and a bunch of content. And then number 2, and then the same amount of content. And we tell people always ask in the group, should that be a list? And the answer is no. At that point, it should be a heading, right? Because the idea is the list is giving them information that there is 7 items. They're all coming in a row. They're all like each other. They all pertain to a certain subject or group. When it's a numbered hierarchy in a document, that's a different kind of thing.
Yeah. And if you did try to make that a list, you would create a convoluted experience for the end user. I mean, it would be so confusing, I think. right?
Well,
Like if
what
every heading was a list item and then all the text within there was a sub item of that list item, I think it would be a really confusing experience.
Well, where it would become confusing is if you had bullets also inside that numbered list, because you'd have
Sure.
list, 6 items, and then you'd hear number 1, the title, and then the paragraphs, and then you'd hear list level 2, and then
Mm-hmm.
list 6 items, and then, on and on. So it's a mixing of content, and, trying to paint a mental picture of where you are in that content. So
Yeah.
what's number, we've got on a tangent here.
I
What
know.
is number 4, right?
So number 4
yeah.
is, does color or line weights indicate additional information, right? And we're starting to talk about, what we've talked about before, use of color alone,
Right.
right? A lot of times in infographics, designers will use different colors for different values within the graphic.
Right. Think about like
And
a map with high crime areas, right?
yep,
So
yep,
that, it's going to show red is like high crime, and maybe yellow is medium
yeah.
crime, and green is low crime. We see that all the time.
Yeah, I think WCAG uses the example of Tom's sales are in red and Mary's sales are in blue type of thing,
Sure.
right? And that of course is violating
The use of color.
use of color alone, right? And
Yeah.
because a, you want to make sure that you have sufficient contrast between those values, um, but then B, also making sure that from a colorblind standpoint, you can differentiate those values,
Right.
because we talked about before about stoplight syndrome,
Yep.
where we love to use red and green as positive and negative values or whatever, but that is the most common type of color blindness, right?
So going back to where we were getting, kind of, why we put this question in here
Mhm.
is, if I'm trying to relate to a screen reader user and a complex infographic that uses color to indicate something, how am I going to relate that information?
Mhm.
Right? Because if we go back to our crime map, what am I going to tell the user? Do I tell them crime map showing statistical rates of crime for 2023? That tells me 0,
Nothing.
other than there's a map there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But then I've got to be thinking, okay, is it the juxtaposition of how many red areas there are? Or is it the fact that this certain area has a very high crime rate, or that east of the railroad tracks is, lower crime, or whatever? There's all sorts of things that can be extrapolated based on the color that's in the map. So while from a compliance standpoint, we talk about use of color, and people always say use of color alone. It's actually use of
Use of
color,
color. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But so from a compliance standpoint, yes, we have that. But from an infographic standpoint, does the color of the items make a difference? And if it does, how am I going to relate that information to the end user, right?
Yep.
So I mean, that's, I think, the key takeaway there.
And we've talked about this before, right? I mean, a great solution is to apply patterns to the elements, or make one line solid, one line dotted, one line dashed, to kind of differentiate those values, right?
Right, because line weight is the other thing, right? And so again, going back to alt text experience or infographic description, if I have an infographic with dotted lines and solid lines, how am I going to talk about those?
Yeah.
Right? And I think this actually goes to the next, we're going to skip one here, and we'll go back to it. But number 6 is, can I support the graphic with additional body text? And I think that principle goes right along with use of color and line weights to carry information, right?
It does, but I think it also goes a long way to making your content accessible to all people,
Oh,
right?
for sure.
And I want to tell you, when I'm reading an article, I honestly don't even pay attention to the figures.
See, and I'm
And
the
that's just
opposite.
me. But
I'm the
that's just,
opposite.
and I think that's a great example of the point that everybody doesn't consume content the same way.
See, I'll
You know
look
what
at
I
a
mean?
figure and then I'll scan the text to try to see if I can understand it. I'll look at the figure and, kind of get a 3-second idea of what it's about. And then I'll go, okay, where are they talking about this in the article? And I start looking for that see figure 5 in the text to as an anchor.
That's the only time I do look at the figure. Like if they say see figure 1 or, see figure
Yeah.
whatever, then okay, I will jump over and be like, okay.
Right.
But then I'm looking for the meat in the body of the text.
See,
That's
and
just me.
I'm just a
Yeah.
visual learner, and
Yeah.
that just makes everybody different, right?
Yep.
So can I support, but going back to your point of the supporting body text, uh, helps everyone, I think is a key principle. Now,
Mhm.
in scientific papers, it's a little harder because the
Right.
goal is to let the end user come up with their own conclusion. But you can still talk about your findings and say the relationship between this and this was found to be this rate, and talk about those associations without giving a perspective. I think is a possible journey that you can then make,
Right.
and so I think most of the time when it comes to making content accessible, it's an afterthought. It is the thing at the end. So for a lot of us, sadly, I'm sure some of our listeners are going, nope, I know that'll never happen where I work because I don't get it until the cake's baked. Right. And so the
Yeah.
idea of adding supporting body text is almost, nil. But that comes back to, as accessibility advocates, being able to talk to your design teams and say, look, when we know we did a report this year and we're going to do it next year, can you get with me a week or 2 or 3 weeks before, whatever the time frame needs to be, before we have to start working on this, so I can show you where all the pain points are to improve this from last year's version to this year's version. And I think if we can do that, then it's much easier than trying to jump in the middle of while they're trying to develop the report, or wait till the end and try to see what you can add. I think that's just a much better approach.
Yes. Yes, I
Right.
totally agree.
All right, so let's go back to number 5, Chad.
So what is the volume of data?
Right?
And can there be an alternate presentation? Right? So how much, how much data are you dealing with? Right?
Right.
Um, a lot of times in an infographic, you've got like a number of data points,
Yep.
right? And, I find that a lot of times people instinctively want to describe every data point in that infographic,
Yes.
but you have to ask the question, what is the story you're trying to tell here? Is it, when I look at this infographic, am I analyzing every data point? Or
No.
is the
You're
infographic showing me a trend over time? Right.
right.
And if the answer is no, I'm just trying to show a trend, then you describe the trend.
Right,
Right.
the beginning and
Yeah.
the end, right? In
Yep.
2019, we did $50 million in sales, and by 2023, we're at 90 million in sales,
And
right?
there's been a steady increase over that period of time, right?
Or maybe
Whatever it
that
might
in
be.
2021 we had a sharp drop
A dip.
and
Yeah.
and then recovered, right? I mean,
Yep.
there's lots of ways to do it. That's why our Secrets of Writing Effective Alt Text is such a great class, because the last class we had was fantastic. They had
Yeah.
so many great questions, and we were able to walk through a bunch of examples. We literally give you images and graphics to write alt text for in the class, and then we talk about what those answers are. It's definitely a great thing. But when it comes to alternate presentations, you have to be a little careful, because if I have a bar chart with 50 data points across 3 different categories, and we see those bar charts where it's 3 bars for every data set, and then you've got 50 data sets, it's 150 data points.
Yeah.
If you make a table, you're like, well, I can't describe that in alt text, so I'm just going to make a table for it and say it's an alternate presentation. That's a
That's a
grid of
lot of data.
150. So
Yeah.
just because it's in a table doesn't automatically make it more accessible.
Right.
And so we always kind of, I don't know, talk about table summaries as kind of an afterthought, and maybe, but it's not really required. In that instance, it's absolutely a good idea to provide a table summary that says the following table explains the relationships between, these three data sets across this range. and give them some information to understand what's happening. Because if you just have 150 data points in a table, imagine trying to figure out the relationship between cell A26 and cell J25, right?
Yep.
I mean, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such a cognitive load that it's a barrier, but it's also talks about universal design learning. Some people will digest a table better, both sighted or non-sighted, screen reader user or not, better than they might just look at a bar chart or a line graph. So, it is not that you shouldn't do one or the other. It's you should do both, because you're